Well, just to say, I'm delighted to be able to speak to you um, uh, from Dublin on this huge subject of Ireland and Scotland and Brexit and the consequences of it for us all. Um, now, I'll speak for about 40 minutes or so. I want to draw a good lot on work I've been doing as a journalist and with the Irish Times and as an academic researcher. I'm based in University College Dublin in the Institute for British Irish Studies, which is an institute that's been studying the British Irish relationship really since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. I've done a huge amount of work on this, including plenty of work on Scotland. Um, but so I really want to. It's useful from my point of view to recap for as it were a general audience on some of this research I've been doing, and it really to inject ideas and discussion into our follow up discussion. Um, I'm going to be rather more analytical than advocating, if you like, because I think that's the way to get bring forward some ideas on how best to analyze what we're seeing before us. And there are lots and lots, of course, of comparisons to be drawn between Ireland and Scotland, both politically but also historically. And I'll draw on some of those as well. And just to say personally, I have a number of Scottish links. My father's mother, Jess, her father moved from Aberdeenshire to Kilkenny in the 1850s, where her father was an estate manager there, having worked in the same kind of capacity around Scotland. And so I grew up on my father's side was a Presbyterian background. My grandfather was from Armagh in the north of Ireland, came to Dublin in the early 1900s, and I grew up there later on. So that's one set of backgrounds. And I was there last year in Aberdeen, or the year before, at a conference where there's an Institute for Scottish Irish Studies in the university there, and made some contacts on that occasion. I've worked then in various capacities as a journalist in the Irish Times, where I was a foreign editor and an assistant editor, um, as a researcher in various institutes, including the Institute for International and European Affairs in Dublin, where over the years since the 1990s, we've had a study group looking at Britain and Europe and the way it worked out and the consequences for Ireland. We've done 3 books and a whole lot of studies on this. And again, the Scottish issue has come up repeatedly, of course, in that setting. Um, and one of the points we've made is that looking at the UK and Europe, there's a deep issue of sovereignty involved. And you have an absolute vision of sovereignty, which is now coming to the foreground, particularly with the hard Brexiteers. And it means that there's a great difficulty in conceiving the sharing of sovereignty amongst this tradition and these politicians in Britain. And of course, that affects internal relations within the United Kingdom, as well as our external relationship, notably, of course, their relations with Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I'll look at that as I go through and give you some ideas about how to analyze that. I'm involved in this institute in UCD in a project on constitutional futures after Brexit, it's called. And we're looking particularly at the intersection of potential constitutional futures in the UK and Ireland and how they intersect and work out with one another. I've also been involved in a very interesting study group um, in University College London in the Constitution unit there, which is examining with a group of academics from London University, from uh, Dublin in Trinity and UCD, from Belfast in Queen's and University of Ulster, and at the University of Pennsylvania, a working group on unification referendums on the island of Ireland. and we've published an interim report, which is available from the UCL Constitution Unit website. And I'll touch on that. And I'm also doing work with the Centre for Constitutional Change in Edinburgh and with a number of other Scottish colleagues. So that's those are some of the issues I'll touch on. And I'll also, when I look historically towards the end of my remarks, I look at some of the very interesting connections more close to Oban and Ireland, in particular, my friend Sam MacDonald's wonderful shieling looking over Loch Ativ, which commemorates the old story of Deirdre of the Sorrows, and that links our two places together in a very compelling way. Now, first of all, I want to look at what I have headlined Scotland and Ireland now, and it's particularly the context of the United Kingdom. The whole future of the United Kingdom is moving to the top of your political agenda in Scotland, but also throughout England and in other parts of the UK, in a way that was really unforeseen several years ago, and is taking lots of people by surprise, including those in the major political parties. So this dual sovereignty crisis, as I describe it, externally vis-a-vis the EU and internally vis-a-vis the constituent elements of the UK, is now coming to a head. It's been long in the making. It's been stoked, though, by the Brexit, by the departure from the European Union, and of course the way that was carried and not carried through England and Wales, but certainly not carried in Scotland and not carried either in Northern Ireland. And that differentiation stokes up the consequences of this sovereignty problem. The work that I'm doing is based on analysis of scenarios in our institute in UCD. And I want just to describe some of this again as a contribution to some ideas as how best to understand it. And what we did, we wanted to identify the drivers of change, potential political and major constitutional change in the context of Brexit. So the first element we took was the nature of the Brexit departure. And of course, it wasn't specified. And the whole debate has been whether it's going to be hard or soft. That is, more distant from the EU that the UK was departing from, or closer to it. And in the event we have a hard version, next to no deal, perhaps as hard as you could get, pulling out of the single market and the customs union, with all the consequences we're now seeing flowing from that. And the other element that we looked at in drawing up these scenarios was what we call the power dynamics in the United Kingdom itself, the level of centralization of decision-making and power as between Westminster, London, and again, the constituent units. And of course, one of the effects, and the harder the Brexit, the more these effects have manifested themselves, has been a re-centralization of power back to London, as the competences, the governing competences that were in Brussels, such as trade and agriculture, for example, are re-centralized back to London rather than being brought back to the devolved authorities where some of them were meant to be. And you know better than I do the full consequences of that over the last 3 years. Now, if you combine these two driving forces, we drew up scenarios. I'll just sketch them out here, again, as a contribution to our later discussion. Excuse me. If you combine the hard Brexit with the centralized power, we drew a scenario up about the breakup of the UK, which is the most radical outcome. And that would include Scottish independence, potential and actual Irish unification, English sovereignty, Welsh independence too. I mean, you can draw this quite hard-edged outcome. And ostensibly, we've got this centralization of power and the distant or hard Brexit. So this potential scenario is very much on the cards. It's plausible. It may not be desirable. Some people desire it, some don't, but it's certainly plausible analytically. Whereas, had there been a closer outcome um, uh, uh, with a softer Brexit, even though centralized power remained predominantly in London, there was the option of a renegotiated EU in which unionism would be reimagined and a reformist kind of approach to Scotland would have more opportunity to succeed. An alternative to that would be where you have widely dispersed power and it's still a hard Brexit is what we call a differentiated outcome. And that's manifested most particularly in the outcome for Northern Ireland, which has stayed in this hybrid state, recognizing its unique political aspects, but where it remains in the EU customs union, but out of the single market with all the consequences specified in the protocol. And the fourth scenario, roughly sketched, is a federalizing UK, and that would resolve in principle or in theory, according to its proponents, most of the problems around the UK of this dual sovereignty problem, but it requires a much closer relationship with the EU than is allowed for by the hard Brexiteers. And therefore, the whole question of agency to achieve it is very hard to specify. The Labour Party has been working on this, but it's unconvincing, it seems to me, so far. And you have to, assess that. So those are sketching from Dublin, kind of analytical picturing of the way the UK might go. This has huge consequences for Ireland. Thinking about the possible futures involved, we see many of the political manifestations now, the reassertion by the Johnson government of this centralized assertive unionism, his remark in passing about the disaster that was devolution reveals this. And again, it's, I'm sure, well covered and discussed in the Scottish terms. What strikes me is there fascinating historical parallels going on here. I'm reminded of the Home Rule movement of the 1880s and 1890s, and that whole movement which prefigured over 40 years in the struggle for Irish independence, which ended up with violence, where you had, after the Home Rule Bill in 1893 fell, after Gladstone's government, you had this so-called attempt to kill Home Rule with kindness, a so-called constructive unionism, where there was a lot of spending and attempts at land reform and actual land reform in Ireland, but that was only broken by the parliamentary arithmetic when it changed in 1911. Now, it's worth recalling this because there are in this imperial structure of the UK many of those kinds of historical parallels. As we know, we didn't get home rule in Ireland. It was interrupted by the First World War, and then there was a transition in that war to violence, to the 1916 rebellion, to the 1918 election, and then to the Irish War of Independence, and the whole debate about revolution and violence and its role in achieving independence, which we're now having to remember 100 years on, and are doing and attempting to come to terms with that. So those are parallels arising from the structure. The agency I mentioned earlier for change is hard to distinguish, and one has to understand what's going on in unionism, in unions, and amongst unionists to come to grips with this. And of course, this is something, as we look at the consequences for Ireland of the way these forces work out, we have to understand all of those elements much more clearly. If we're going to have a debate, as it's now opening up in Ireland, about Irish unification as one of the consequences of what's happening, we have to understand what unionisms are concerned with throughout the UK, but particularly in the north of Ireland. And again, again, we've been doing work on this in our institute. We've published a special issue of a journal on comparative unionism. And this is kind of preliminary to the really important discussions that we're going to be facing over the next 5 or 10 years, it seems to us, as these issues work themselves out. Now, they're working themselves out, secondly, in a major context of the European Union itself after the UK's departure. And that departure, it's worth underlining, and I certainly argue this, the fundamental weakness of the UK vis-a-vis the EU came through in these negotiations, notwithstanding the assertion, particularly by the Brexiteers, but on both sides, of the principle of sovereign equality. This is a state of 65 or so, 66 million, up against a continental entity of 400 or 500 million. Somewhat reduced, of course, by Britain's departure, but the asymmetry of power there is very visible in the negotiation. And the tattered, fragmented nature of that agreement that was reached the end of December is now beginning to work itself out, it seems to me, and this is showing itself up. And of course, one of the temptations for the politicians involved is to try and cover or mask that by blaming the other, and that's one of the issues that's going on. So if a disruptive approach is being sought, it's being sought, I would argue, very much in the context of this, again, dual sovereignty question. And if we're getting rows, which we are, and they're going quite deep-seated now about the trustworthiness of this British government vis-a-vis the Northern Ireland Protocol, where they've, for the third time, raised the issue of breaching articles in the agreement, you're up against an issue that is driven not only by London's relationship with Brussels, but I would say too, in a way, to warn the Scots, you are going to vote in May, about the issue of borders and the disruptive element of borders. I think there's as much of an element of internal politics going on here as there is of external politics. Now, I want to look at the way in which the UK and Ireland futures intersect. And again, I'm drawing on the work where the research we're doing. In Ireland, the whole Brexit crisis, because it's brought Northern Ireland out of the EU against its majority vote, it's opening up a debate on unification, which goes alongside Scotland's own debate on independence and its future. And the two are sort of, as it were, rolling together, and they structurally related and intersected. If you look at this in northern terms, it's striking what's happened in the last 3 years, that the issue of unification has come from being rather quiet, taken for granted, but not as much in the foreground as it now is. And that's happened notwithstanding the establishment of power sharing, and notwithstanding also the attitudes of many people from a Catholic nationalist background towards unity, which changed during the exercise of devolutionary power, because many people from a Catholic nationalist background are willing to accept a devolved settlement in the north of Ireland and not a unification scenario, so long as it works. But if it doesn't work, if it becomes dysfunctional also by taking the state out of the EU, the issue of unity as an alternative has arisen once again. And it's driven by Brexit, partly by demography. The census this year will show probably a Catholic majority within Northern Ireland. It's driven politically by competition looking to the assembly elections next year, where it's conceivable that those from a nationalist, Catholic and other background will actually have a majority over against unionism. And so you've got these complexities opening up, and an abstract issue is becoming much more concrete. One of the things we're doing in our research is we're examining how people are seeing this on the ground, how ordinary citizens are seeing this. There was a small citizens' assembly was held by our colleagues in Queen's University in 2019. They had 50 people gathered, and they particularly asked them about attitudes towards the status quo, that is the continuation of Northern Ireland in the UK, and the potential for Irish unification. And they asked them further about the possible shapes of a united Ireland, because it could be either devolved, which would continue the power sharing arrangements as we now have them in the north, or it could be a unitary in which you no longer would have that power sharing arrangement and devolved governance within Northern Ireland, but have a unitary state centred on Dublin. And in fact, we discovered that for people, first of all, weren't aware that there would be alternative shapes for a united Ireland of that kind. And secondly, that those, as they became aware during that discussion, during that day of the Citizens' Assembly, particularly those from a Protestant Unionist background, became much more interested in a unitary state than in a devolved one, partly because they saw the benefits of escaping from the dysfunctionality of, as they see it, of the devolved power sharing arrangements so far. So we are doing a similar exercise, asking rather similar questions in the Republic in the next couple of months. And we're going to have a very interesting evolution of attitudes and description of attitudes as we go through that piece of research. So in these intersections, not only is the issue of unification being raised in Northern Ireland, but of course it's being raised in the Republic as well. And I want to give you just a brief, as it were, outline of some of the issues that have come up in that debate. And again, towards the end, I'll draw some parallels with the way in which the whole Scottish independence question has been revived and reanimated by Brexit. There are lots of interesting parallels there. But again, the issue of potential unification, while it's been inscribed strongly in Irish nationalism, it's rather abstract, not discussed in any concrete detail. It's there as a kind of piece of mythology or a piece of tokenism, very often politically, but it's suddenly been made concrete by the consequences of Brexit and the realization that the increasingly unstable United Kingdom may force the issue onto an Irish agenda before people have had time to think it right through or prepare for it adequately. And therefore, people are kind of grappling and scrambling to adopt positions on this, realizing that the pace of events may be much more rapid than they previously understood. So the issue is now becoming more strongly defined. It's partly polarized politically because, of course, Sinn Féin, as the strongest nationalist party in Northern Ireland, it's been very much part of their political identity over the years, and it's driven in good large part by the dissatisfaction of their constituency in Northern Ireland with the state of play there. And they are an all-Ireland party, and they did exceedingly well in the elections 1 year ago, where they now are potentially the largest party if it comes to another election. And they drive an agenda which demands preparation for Irish unification through the Parliament, through citizens' assemblies, through a ministry even. And in response to that, the other parties, particularly Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two parties arising from the Irish Civil War, who are now unprecedentedly in coalition with the smaller Green Party, but they have adopted what they called a shared island approach, which is alternative to immediate demands or prospective demands for unity, emphasize a gradualist approach to North-South relations, repairing the Belfast Agreement, Good Friday Agreement institutions, developing good economic, social, political, and cultural relations on the island, um, prior to, and if you like, as a condition for any further discussion about unity. Now, this is an evolutionary agenda, could be seen towards a longer term unity perspective, or it could be seen as one in which Ireland in the Republic would, if it works out this way, be happy with a reformed and changed United Kingdom so long as the borders remained open and relations, human and political and other relations, remain open on the island of Ireland. So that's one set of issues that we're facing up to, that between the gradualist approach and a preparatory approach. And there are those who say on the preparatory side, look, this may go much faster than you're anticipating, driven not least by developments in Scotland, of course. You have to prepare for change. You have to think it through. You have to think particularly about whether the shape of a potential united Ireland would be devolved or unitary. You'd have to think, for example, about whether, if it came to referendums, North and South, which are provided for by consent in the Belfast Agreement, whether the government in Dublin would offer the model of a united Ireland prior to any referendum, or offer alternatively a process such as a constitutional convention, which would be triggered in the event of a vote for unity. And that's a very interesting and important issue. The work we've been doing, and I mentioned it with the University College London Constitution Unit, examines this question of potential unification referendums in Ireland in some detail. The interim report has been published and is available on their website, and we're preparing the final report now. It's a substantial piece of work, something like 250 pages. It analyzes the context in which all this is happening, including some of the context I've outlined here, fills in gaps, particularly about the configuration of referendums, North and South, the shape of an Ireland that would be on offer, this issue of the model or process, and also the effect of developments in the UK on developments in Ireland, this intersection effect that I mentioned. In particular, with the dynamics in Scotland, the Parliament elections in May, the demands arising from that, let us presume, for another independence referendum, how that would work itself out, and the consequent effects on Northern Ireland and on the Republic for this are really worthy of analysis and to be found in detail in that report, which I recommend to you. So in that kind of setting, it's very interesting to see that for Scotland and Northern Ireland and the Republic, these issues of referendums, borders, and EU membership are increasingly shared interests and concerns. So that makes, of course, for wonderful opportunities for comparative political science analysis, but it also has real political consequences, and we need to know what these consequences are politically as citizens if we're going to make sense of it all in the coming period. So that's a kind of sketch of where we are now. I want just to refer, but briefly and very impressionistically, just to mention some of the wonderful history that we share, and which must be, in a way, gets recontextualized because of the recent convergence politically and constitutionally and other respects that I've been describing. And one of the main issues, of course, is the different ways in which Scotland and Ireland got involved in the imperial United Kingdom as it expanded from southeast England over the centuries, over the many centuries, as it became a world empire from the 18th and 19th into the 20th centuries. Ireland and Scotland responded very differently to that kind of empire, imperial power. Uh, uh, Going earlier to the 16th, 17th centuries, you have the whole issue of colonialism, settler colonialism, much of it driven into the northern part of Ireland from Scotland, mainly from lowland Scotland, as we know, and all of the effects of that, plus the effects of the Reformation and the religious changes, the effects of Jacobitism. I'm just mentioning these commonalities and contested histories to contextualize any discussion we would have. Always the distinction between Highland and Lowland Scotland and Ireland comes through. And that particularly is the case, of course, when we go earlier to the early medieval and medieval times. I mentioned my friend Sam MacDonald, who's in the audience, and my wife Deirdre and I have been I visited Oban a couple of years ago to celebrate the shieling that Sam has erected in memory of his of his wife, who died a number of years ago, which commemorates the story of Deirdre of the Sorrows. I'm not sure if maybe you're familiar with this, the great love story of Deirdre and Naoise, where Deirdre fled with Naoise, her young lover, and they went to Scotland, according to the story, but gathered around Loch Ative, are all the place names recording that ancient story, and it's in a very uncanny way. And the memorial looks over this wonderful lake and in a shieling and commemorates it. And I'd recommend you to visit and learn more about it if you haven't encountered it. A message when it was launched in the presence of Mike Russell and Mark Hannafy, Mike Russell MSP, and Mark Hannafy, the Consul General of Ireland, from Michael D. Higgins, the Irish president. Michael D. said, "There is no place on our islands more representative of that shared inheritance than Argyll, once the home of the ancient Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada. It was there that Cuchulainn, the warrior hero of Uladh, was said to have learned the arts of war, and it was there that Deirdre sought sanctuary with Naoise and his brother, Arden and Anya. I am so pleased that a magnificent memorial will now rest forever on Bean Glas, not far from Glan Etive, and may it stand as a monument not only to the common past of the peoples of Scotland and Ireland, but to the shared destiny of our two ancient countries." And that captures very well the drama of this monument. Deirdre and I went to Iona during that time and were entranced, of course, by that monument and the links that it tells about, as the later ones with Dalriada. And the later ones again in different kind of contexts in the 14th century with Robert Bruce. So you've all these links that are re-remembered now, and it's the history of memorials changes as history changes, and therefore it's worth reflecting on this as we talk about, and I'll conclude on these notes, some thoughts about what I would call Irish and Scottish futures. And I mean, I won't apologize for dwelling on, if you like, the macro politics, the constitutional aspects of this. They unfold from these dramatic events that we're living through. It's what I'm studying, and it's what any expertise I bring to bear. But I know that they're regarded, and it comes out in the Citizens' Assembly work we're doing, sometimes again as abstract, but they translate into everyday politics and everyday citizen concerns in in ways that are we must draw on, and that's the use of such encounters as we're having this evening. There are lots of sympathies and a lot more knowledge and active participation in Scottish-Irish affairs in all sorts of ways and levels. We have the rugby match coming up at the weekend. Culturally, through all sorts of literary and other musical links, through recent exchange and study between the Irish government and the Scottish government of links between the two, a report published just in January, which is well worth looking at. The whole question of Northern Ireland unionists and Protestantism and Orangism linked up to Scotland historically, and what happens if Scotland were to leave the UK, what happens to their political identity in that setting. So it's worth thinking about all sorts of futures. Geography won't change, even if history does. We're going to need to think about futures, and if you want to use the constitutional language, that future could be in several different ways that are worth exploring, confederal. And the confederalism denotes states that agree to work together, but don't pool their sovereignty in the fully fledged way that would happen in federations, but retain their independence to do what they want to do alone and agree on what they want to do together. I've been thinking about potential unionism beyond the union. And it might take a confederal form, and it would reassure unionists both in Scotland and Ireland that the links that were established partly institutionally through the Belfast Agreement, such as the British-Irish Council, British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, but these are potential models of futures. One can think of confederal links between the Republic of Ireland and Scotland in order to facilitate rapid EU membership after potential Scottish independence. That's being talked about in the literature. One can think of other Irish-Scottish confederal links in that new setting of joint membership of the EU. One can think of, in similar ways, and some colleagues that I've been working with are developing this idea of a Northern Ireland Scottish set of links, which might include Ireland confederally. I know that in Wales, the Plaid Cymru is thinking about confederal relations with England after potential independence. Adam Price has been talking very interestingly about that. And you have to think then, of course, about Scottish-English relations, not only in the difficult issue of the border, were you to get Scottish independence soon and have to live beside a hard Brexit, how do you handle that border? It's going to be a huge issue in any discussion. Just as we do vis-a-vis the Northern Ireland Protocol. So these futures, I think, are going to be held together. I've looked at this, if you like, analytically rather than as an advocate, but I hope the analysis I've offered helps us to think about the advocacy we might prefer to see closer Irish-Scottish links and to develop these links in a kind of constructive way through meetings such as this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. It was very interesting. There's been a bit of stuff put in the chat. Can we use the blue hand system for people wanting to ask questions? I think that would be the easiest for those of you who haven't been on here before. If you go down to participants at the bottom of your screen and click on that, it comes up in a pop-up window and you should see a little blue hand. And if you want to click on the blue hand, that puts you at the top of the, puts a little blue hand on your icon and moves you to the front of the page 1 so that I can see you quite easily. So people with questions, that would be really good if you could do that. Prior to that, there's the main things that seem to have come up in the chat whilst you've been talking, Paul, are a discussion about federalism, and also the big one is the borders. Borders are obviously going to be a big issue. I think hyped up perhaps more by Westminster and the Unionist side. I think a lot of people on the independent side don't really see it as a big issue, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I fully understand the way it's being hyped. The rational basis of that argument, I presume, is the way the trade flows go, I don't know how convincing those arguments are about where Scotland's pattern of trade with England compared to Europe or external trade. If you assume the kind of the hardness of the border going through any referendum campaign, that's going to be a difficult one. But there's no, you don't have to presume that that border remains hard. The trouble is, how do you manage that if you have to maintain the integrity of the European single market, which is the issue facing the Irish government and the EU and the Northern Ireland authorities in Northern Ireland, because the one thing that's very clear is the determination coming through the EU side in all these negotiations is about protecting that integrity. And if, as Boris Johnson says, the whole point of Brexit was to diverge, and if part of the thinking there is to weaken environmental, labour and other standards in order to compete more effectively on the world market and back into Europe, the determination on the European side is not to see that happen. So we're facing this, if it gets highly disruptive with the Northern Ireland Protocol, if the thing breaks down, we're into a no-deal setting, and that would reinstall a border on the Irish border on land. So it's very hard to read the British government's intention here, except, I mean, one obvious reading is that it's disruptive intent, but it's hard to read how long that would play out for, given their comparative weakness, as I see it. Is it short to medium term or medium to long term? And that's not, that's one set of judgments to make. Lots of accidents may happen in such, a transition. And so we may end up with all sorts of undesired consequences. So I'm saying this is really messy, but not, not insoluble. It depends a lot on what happens in the politics of England, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Mary McCabe, you have a question? You unmute yourself, Mary. Mary, you're muted.
Right. I would see the problem as being the transition period, because, well, Paul mentioned our exports. It's true, we've got, as they keep telling us, 60% of our exports with the UK, but when Ireland became independent, about 90% of their exports were with the UK. It's now down to something like 18%. So we're only in this position with our exports in the UK because we're a captive audience. And the fact remains that we've got a healthy balance of payment. We always export more than we import, unlike the UK. But what I was wondering, with the question of borders, I mean, Norway and Sweden manage their border. The Faroes and Denmark, one's in, one's out, UK. Out the EU. I know that the problem is because they're all in the single market anyway, but would it help if Scotland had a period of being in EFTA, like being an associate member of the EU, so it had a foot in both camps, so to speak, at least in a transition period? Do you think that would be helpful, and we could gradually go into the full EU if we wanted to? I mean, what I think that from the Scottish point of view, we want to keep the borders, all borders, open as much as possible. And to me, the EFTA thing is maybe worth considering. What does Paul think about that?
Yeah, it's theoretically plausible and politically, you know, analytically plausible. How politically doable is it in this fraught encounter between the Brussels and London with this hard Brexiteer government in London is another question. It may be hard to get a hearing and a toleration during that time. This is where Scotland will need allies, including in Dublin, and advocates. And I think, I mean, there are, I'm aware of some moves afoot to develop an awareness more than there is now around the European EU member states that at Scotland's difficulties here, and I think it needs diplomacy now in order to develop that, you know, case. Now, I just say, I mean, and that is important because in 2017, in April 2017, Enda Kenny, the Irish Taoiseach, got the agreement of the European Council that were Northern Ireland to unite with Ireland, it would automatically become a member of the EU, just as East Germany did in 1990. And that German memory and precedent was really important because the Irish government was one of the few, and in a minority initially, to support German unification at a December council meeting in 1989. And the next 6 months, from January to July 1990, Ireland had the EU presidency and oversaw a couple of special summits in which German unification was agreed unconditionally, and earning the great gratitude of the German government. And I remember very vividly Coles being in Dublin 6 years later in 1996 during another Irish EU presidency, when he said, "You stood by us and we will never forget that." And it's true. And therefore, actions and words and diplomacy matter, you know, in these kinds of settings.
Consequences.
I think the element of legality and due process that is part of both the British and the Scottish constitutional culture, you know, are worth emphasizing in this setting, and they're very different to the Spanish one, for example, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know, so I think the Scottish case needs to be heard as much, maybe much more than it already has been.
Through the courts, maybe?
Yes, but around, diplomatically around Europe, you know, yes.
Thanks.
Thank you. Andrew Simpson, you had your hand up and it's disappeared. I don't know if that's an accident or do you still want to speak?
No, I think the question was covered from the previous one, thanks.
Okay, thanks. In that case, we'll go to John Gosling.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Paul. I actually rejoice in having a daughter who's called Deirdre, and for very many of the reasons that you were talking about. As you can tell, I was brought up in the middle of England, in Birmingham, and moved to Scotland in 2002 officially. I was coming up before then. One of the things that always confused me, and I still don't understand it, is how on earth people voted for Brexit, particularly in England. I found it very strange. And I read a book by Fintan O'Toole, yes, called Heroic Failure, ? And it led me to wonder, first of all, what you thought about all that, and whether Brexit can in fact be sustained. Will there not be a revolution? What do you think? How stable is it? How stable is this Brexit, do you think, in England?
Oh, I think everything I've said would lead me to believe that it's unstable,
Yeah,
destabilizing, and likely to be unstable,
yeah,
and reflects much deeper processes of in going on in the British state and in the empire that, you know, the global power that it had before. So
yeah,
it's an unfolding of very long-term processes, and um, uh, um, I think so many of these issues were under discussed or not discussed at all, or taken completely for granted in all sorts of stereotypes and political mythologies, which Fintan O'Toole explores brilliantly very
yeah,
often in his work. And his background, you know, is as a literary, cultural
yeah,
critic, very fine theatre critic, very good literary critic, and he has that eye um, uh, in political analysis for the telling, not only the telling phrase, but the telling cultural moments, you know, and
yeah,
transitions. So he does that very, very well. Um, uh, but to say that it's destabilizing, uh, I don't think that means necessarily that it's incapable of reform or that it has to go in a revolutionary direction. If you define, you know, breakup as revolution, which in many ways, of course, it would be, that would be radical revolutionary change. Whether it became a kind of social revolutionary change is another different kind of dimension. Um,
mm,
uh, Certainly constitutionally radical change. But the trouble is, you've got a waning sense of Britishness, as we know. That is the glue that held things together. Austerity has driven stakes into the welfare state glue, the post-war social contract that held things together, including with Scotland, obviously. You've got the, I didn't mention, but obviously seen from Ireland, the huge shift of political affiliation and identity amongst people from an Irish Catholic background in Scotland, from the Labour Party to the SNP in the
mm,
last period, is another shift which can be related to these ones. And then you've got the way in which English government in England is so centralized. That's one of my
yeah,
um, it's also a central. I mean, you've got the whole ways in which cities and city regions are underplayed, and again that reflects back on the party political structure and the constitutional structure that they have. So there's an awful lot that needs deep reform and change. Not to mention the House of Lords, all that Westminster apparatus of government. Now, uh, there's a kind of belated realization of this, and I'm analytically amongst the political class, but I don't see agency of change. I think the agency of change is much more, well, you can say at the periphery rather than at the centre, but that's unfair. I don't like to think about Scotland or Ireland or Wales as peripheral. It's a sort of and the nationalism involved, and particularly in Scotland, but I would say in classical terms, in Ireland, the Irish nationalism was an anti-imperial nationalism
mm,
against that assertion of dominant global power as it manifested itself in Ireland. Well, going way back, of course, as I sketched, in colonialism and dependence, but also in the modern period and the 19th into the 20th centuries with empire. Now, Scotland and Ireland experienced empires in very different way. Scotland was far more part of empire, as was the northern part of Ireland, through that industrialization of empire and the participation in all sorts of ways. The English fallout from this, the hollowing out of that industrialism in the 1970s and 80s, is part of these big changes. So I'm the big question I keep asking is, where is the agency of change
yeah,
in the UK? And it's hard to see, and therefore to some extent that gap has been filled by constitutional politics, including in Scotland. You know, I don't know if that helps you, but
well, thanks very much. Yeah, that's yeah, that is very useful actually. I think. Yeah, it's not a very good outlook, but still.
No, it's you mean what you know from as an analyst of history and politics is that sometimes history speeds up. I mean, the famous remark attributed to Lenin that there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. This was to describe periods of real revolutionary change, but it can describe periods of more gradual change as well.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Breed.
Hi there, Fáilte. Welcome, Paul, to being virtually in Oban, if not physically here, and a big warm welcome to Deirdre as well. Here's my question. We are still running in the polls in the late 50s with regards to popular opinion as the moved will of the people towards an independent Scotland. And there is no will to grant Scotland a referendum. Putting on your thinking cap and looking at the situation that we are in at the moment, realistically, when do you think we will be starting the negotiations for an independent Scotland?
Ooh. Let me answer this question by thinking comparatively again. In this working group that I've been involved in from University College London, we're having to examine the circumstances in which a Northern Ireland Secretary of State would call a referendum on Irish unification. Now, they're obliged to do that if it appears that there is a majority for it. There's also discretionary power, but thinking about the evidence that would be brought to bear in any such decision, well, you could think about elections, including parliamentary or assembly elections. You could think about a vote in Parliament. You could think about polling, and you could think about the makeup of coalitions. And I think now there's no specification of the detail of that in the Northern Ireland example, but I think the lessons to be drawn there and some of the informal soundings we took on it in this working group would point to a sustained period of majority sentiment in favor of a vote on Irish unification. And this would need to be sustained across those pieces of evidence in a way that's convincing and suddenly becomes unstoppable, if you like, towards a decision. And some of the politicians we've talked to have said, look, politics can happen that way. You make a decision because that evidence is there. Now, I've been thinking about, and I mentioned that there are these commonalities now with referendums on borders and EU membership between Scotland and Ireland. The government in London says no, it's settled for a generation. But people we've spoken to and I've spoken to believe that were there to be that kind of sustained evidence across a span of political arenas, it would become at a certain point impossible to resist. Therefore, you would go towards a referendum. Now, I think that's it becomes an issue of political judgment. There's no dogmatism there. In between, you might, of course, have general elections called by Johnson. I think there's been whisperings of this. It might suit him to go after the COVID thing to get a reinforced majority, and therefore to be able to say, let us say, after the Scottish elections in May, that he has a mandate to trump that, and that this would be politics, raw politics. Now, then you're left with where do you go from there? Do you go in the Catalan direction people ask? Do you go, some people ask, but dulcetly, do you go in the do you have to start thinking about a violent direction as happened in Ireland? Or does that undermine your legitimacy in the wider European setting? So you're into these periods of change can be very fraught and difficult. So I can't predict. Again, I would suggest that it helps to think in scenario terms, that I put up 3 or 4 potential futures there. You need to examine those systematically and think them through, and then you're somewhat better prepared for them, perhaps.
Roger Mackenzie, you've got a few things in the chat. Would you like to talk to us? Where are you, Roger?
I'm over here.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Yes.
I'd like to talk to you. Well, you better give me a line to follow. I'm a bit all over the place. What I haven't sent, and I've all.
You've muted yourself.
But I just unmuted myself. Don't like this gloom. Anyway, I think Scotland's best bet is to leave the UK first, rather than wait on any Irish unity vote. Unity vote. If we wait for Ireland to agree that it's leaving the UK, I think we'll have missed the boat totally.
Yeah. I even though we're drawing parallels and making comparisons, there's no. I don't think it's great political competition between Ireland and Scotland in this respect. I mean, who gets there first, as it were? It's the dynamics, even though they overlap with one another, are not the same. They're not driven in the same way. So I think the much more immediate set of issues arise in Scotland more than in Northern Ireland. On the other hand, was the protocol to collapse, you'd get a political, and were power sharing to collapse in Northern Ireland, you'd get a political crisis there, the reimposition of direct rule, and you might get, in Northern Ireland opinion, there's an very important group now of people who say, when they're asked in polling what religion they are, they say they're neither Catholic nor Protestant. When they're asked what affiliation they have, they say they're other, not unionist nor nationalist. And these are 30 to 40% of people now, including particularly younger electors. Many of people like that don't vote. They get mobilized, though, into referendum campaigns, and they're often quite highly educated. So these are and I think there's similarly unmobilized groups within the Scottish electorate, as you know, as we saw in 2014. So these are volatile entities. Even though we're watching one another more closely politically, I think the driving forces are distinct, in the two places. And therefore, to answer I don't know anyone in Scotland who's saying we must wait until something happens in Ireland. And I don't think any of the nationalists in the north are doing the same thing. They're more analysing than preferring that way.
Agreed.
Yeah. Sorry? No. Colin. You're muted. You're muted, Colin.
Yeah, sorry about that. Your gut feeling, Paul, and what the polls are saying in Ireland on the public's opinion of unification, because the feeling we get from your leading politicians is they're pretty much playing it down. So what do you think personally, and what are the polls saying?
An interesting, a very important dynamic that we're trying to examine in our research is to understand if there is a movement at the base among citizens, which is more pronounced and perhaps more rapid than amongst the political, leaderships. What's driving that? And one of the things that conceivably might be driving it, let's say through the COVID crisis, which is a health crisis, we have a developed health system in the Republic, which combines public and private in a way that's very distinctive, comes out of the history, comes out of church involvement in social welfare provision and health provision, but is now increasingly dysfunctional for a much more modern and wealthy, a better organized society. So we have a huge issue of health reform. You have a lot of admiration in the Republic for the National Health Service. In England, a lot of Irish people would know it and know that it's free at the point of, free at the point in principle anyway. So see that as a way to improve things. So if people north and south see unity as a way to a better, a fairer, a newer Ireland, that is a kind of ground force working towards unification. If through a crisis in the European arrangements, through the protocol, for example, and the way it might be driven by a disruptive Brexiteer London, if suddenly people say, look, we have to maintain access to European markets and want to do that and want to do it rapidly, again, that would shift things. And there's some evidence of those shifts happening, but it's early days on that yet. And were you to get a lot depends here on economic performance north and south, whether people would see the issue of taxation and the British subsidy is brought into bear in the same way that perhaps it is in Scotland also, and the way that would be negotiated out. So until these are clarified and debated much more and researched much more, it's hard to say. But my gut feeling is that the driving forces I've identified in the UK, insofar as they bear on Ireland north and south, are driving people towards a much more articulated sense of what unification would involve. And if in that setting you can link together dissatisfaction with the status quo with the hope of change in a transformed Ireland, well, you may get a momentum that becomes much more powerful than the political elites understand.
Thank you.
You spoke earlier, Paul, about quite a bit. You talked quite a bit about federalism and confederalism, and spoke about the need to devolve more power. It seems to me that not only from Westminster, but even in Scotland, that power is being centralised more and more.
Yes.
How do we stop that? I mean, if you look to the Scandinavian countries where they're much more, the power is devolved so much more to the local areas. How do we counter that, even from our own government?
Very good question. I have written and done a good lot of work on the nature of local government in Ireland. And there's an important and interesting league table of local government powers around Europe, amongst about 38 or 40 European states. And the last time I looked, Ireland was down at the bottom of it with Moldova. The UK was only a few points up. I think in Scotland you have this junction between centralised and localised power as well. It's part of the system in the UK over the years that we've experienced, and it's been reinforced during Irish independence. A lot of the trouble in Irish governance is to do with the lack of such powers, including in housing and environmental stuff at local level. So it's one, just to say that you get your independence, at state level doesn't mean that you guarantee your democracy at local level. You have to fight for that additionally. And I think that, if one wants new ingredients to be injected into an Irish constitutional debate, I would hope it would be from this direction too. There's some evidence of that happening in the Green Party, some of the left-wing parties. I'm not sure about Sinn Féin, but it could happen there. And certainly there's a very strong case to be made for it against in a more better educated society and richer society, more well-off society that needs to do environmental things, for example, at a much more local level. I'm sure there are similar cases to be made in Scotland and of course in England too, because the nature of local democracy in England has been really hollowed out, you know. And if you compare it to continental experience in France, in Germany, all around, not just in federal systems, but in, you know, in systems such as the French one or in Italy, you see how much more power there is to be had at local level when you really go after it.
Yeah, I think you have to get the actual politicians that we vote in have to be the sort that won't become used to power, and like once you've got a bit of power, you want more power.
Yes, yeah.
That's one of the problems that maybe we have. Maggie, you've got your hand up. You need to unmute yourself.
Couldn't find the yellow hand. I've searched for it. It's been, thank you very much, Paul. It's been a very, very interesting discussion. I'm the chair of the 1916 Rising Centenary Committee, Scotland, and we did and have been doing a whole number of events since 2016. And just after the referendum on Brexit, Michael D. Higgins came to Scotland to meet the Irish organisations in Scotland, the Irish diaspora. We had a wonderful meeting with him and a sort of cultural event with the Scottish government at night. And it's become very, very clear to me that the relationship with Ireland, as we know, is very long established and historic, but it's incredibly important for all the reasons that you've laid out. I mean, in terms of the relationship with Germany and so on, I think that relationship is something that we absolutely have to cherish and develop. And I think it's in the 1916 committee. I mean, one of the things we've tried to do is to do a bit of education about really these old links and commonalities, as well as a bit of historical education about all the issues around the Rising. And obviously, we have James Connolly as a Irish Scot. Yes. And we also had Margaret Skinnader, who I've done a bit of work around. Margaret Skinnader, who was a Scottish-Irish Scot from Coatbridge. But the big difficulty, I mean, we've done a lot of events, we've done quite a lot of work, we've publicised and so on, but it is very difficult in the west of Scotland because of the depth of unionism and a vicious kind of orangism that every so often erupts and shows itself. But really, I think that the Irish-Scottish relationship will be hugely helpful when we reach the point of deciding that we're going for independence. Because I don't think there's a chance in hell that the Westminster government will ever agree to it. I think we have to reach a point when we decide, brave people decide we're going to go for it. I mean, like Connolly did at a particular point, now is the time, we have to do it, or it will elude us for a long, long time. Yes. I don't know what you think about that, but that's certainly my personal view.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, wow. Well, that phrase, that it will elude us, and there are historical moments. One of the phrases we use in our research is the phrase constitutional moment. And moment, that use of the word moment comes out of Hegel and continental philosophy, and it can be a long moment. I mean, it's one, it's a, but that they are that they are historically defined and particular opportunities
Yes.
is the knowledge of all revolutionaries and all, you know, political change involves risk, and you have to be able to recognize the conjunctures. Now, in this school of politics that I'm involved in UCD, we've just done a big handbook with Oxford University Press, Handbook of Irish Politics. So I've written the chapter on British-Irish relations, and because it was confined to the republics, the politics of a republic, not including Northern Ireland, I had to include a lot of Northern Ireland material in the chapter. But I started off the chapter by remembering a colleague of mine who worked with me on several of the books we did on Britain and Europe and Ireland, Ronan Fanning, who was professor of history in UCD.
Yeah.
And he wrote a fine book about the Irish War of Independence, and a fine biography of De Valera before he died.
Oh, yeah.
And he drew on his long-standing study of British 19th and 20th century politics in relation to Ireland to draw the conclusion that violence was inevitable. It was inescapable for Ireland to achieve what it did in terms of its independence, because that British imperial force was not going to concede beyond the Home Rule offering, and that was pretty minimalist if you look at it in comparison. Was not going to concede the kind of independence, even the Dominion status that was achieved and then built on, without the use of violence. Now that comes from a particular analysis of that particular conjuncture, that moment, if you like, in British history, which was the high imperial moment, remember? And of course, that was what really worried the British ruling class at the time, is that the consequences for empire of letting Ireland go, as it were, peacefully, notwithstanding 1916 and the provocation that they saw involved there, because we went then thereafter through 1918. You know, we had the elections. You know, and it was the consequences of the so. What you have to ask yourself is whether that imperial conjuncture finds its equivalent now at the tail end of empire, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, I'm not going to answer the question directly. I don't know. I mean, I could well say, and anyone would say, just as Irish nationalists said from the first Dáil Éireann, when they sat in Dublin and said, look, we're not going to Westminster, we're going to try and do this peacefully, but they reached the conclusion amongst themselves that they had to do it militarily as well. And that is a very difficult and finely judged, moment in time. Whether you reach that in Scotland is a big, huge question. I can't answer that for you.
No. Thank you so much.
Andrew Simpson.
Hi, Paul. Thanks again for tonight. I was just wondering if there was a successful plebiscite vote in Scotland this year, do you think this would be more, would this put more pressure on the UK government, and would it be accepted internationally?
A successful, if it was held after, if it was called by the Scottish government,
yeah, as part of the elections this year.
Well, I would have thought yes is the answer, but again, just let me go back to 1919 and 1918. What did Ireland do? They went to the the Versailles Treaty. They weren't allowed in because the British had done their diplomacy with Wilson, And it was President Wilson who didn't accept that the Irish would have a locus standi at that meeting. If there's a vote, if the Nationalists get a majority in the May elections and call a referendum and win it, you've got a something equivalent to the 1918 electoral mandate in Ireland. You have to go and diplomatize that, legalize that, legitimize it. I would have thought that's a very strong card to play. And as I mentioned in the Northern Ireland context, it's a democratic card after all.
Absolutely.
Where it goes to, again, you have to, that's why you have a big need for a diplomatic apparatus to deliver on this. It may need, you know, it may need qualitative change. You also need, you need allies who can multiply your voices around Europe at that point.
Thank you.
Edward.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Great discussion tonight. It's a sort of long-winded question, so if you could bear with me for a minute or two. I was brought up in the 60s when Celtic were doing well in the European Cup, etc. And a lot was made of the fact of, because of the success, violence in Northern Ireland didn't spread to the west coast of Scotland. Bearing in mind what has been said by unionists and paramilitaries in the last week or so, can you see violence erupting again in Northern Ireland and then spreading to mainly the west coast of Scotland?
Gosh.
Thank you.
All the evidence that I know of says that loyalism is not a completely spent force militarily, but it's minuscule. There might be 200 people involved in some of these organizations. A lot of them are to do with street gangs and drug, semi-criminal stuff, and that's well enough known. The major mass organizations have been stood down, but the DUP in particular has handled all this crisis over the protocol so badly. Their links with the Tories in London have been so incompetent, and they've been ditched so much that they're very worried about the electoral outcomes next year in the assembly elections next year. And the polling shows that they're falling away and they're bleeding away support both to more intransigent unionists and also to the other group that I mentioned. So they're inclined very much to stoke this question and to use it then as a kind of threat in dealing with London, dealing with others. So there's a kind of artificial aspect to this. The trouble is, this is, you know, if you let this go on and you don't respond to it politically, it can become self-fulfilling, arguably. I don't see much evidence for that yet, and I think there'd be so much reaction against any resort to violence, including from within the Protestant community itself, that is probably containable. And the shift would happen much more towards opening up the question of unification or alternative futures rather than that direction. Now, these are just my political hunches. So I don't see much real potential for that kind of spillover you mentioned. But if the British state regards all these developments as existential crises, remember they've stoked these waters too. One of the things that Brandon Lewis did as Secretary of State was drop the agreement that was reached last year to handle the question of historic crimes, and one of the sets of lobbyings he was getting was from the British Army, There's big loyalist disquiet at that because the loyalists were working with the British Army in stoking a lot of this violence during the Troubles. So that kind of deep state stuff could come into play. I presume it could come into play in Scotland as well. I mean, this is an existential crisis for the rulers of the UK, and some of them are exceedingly unscrupulous and untrustworthy, as we've seen. So, and that's something that I would say, but I would be reflecting a lot of Irish opinion on this, let us say.
That's scary.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
No, it is scary, but I don't so I don't rule it out. I'm just saying the driving forces again of this may not simply come from street loyalism. It may come from very other different directions.
Can I add something? The word that you used was troubles.
Yes.
Troubles in Northern Ireland. Is it not more the case it's a civil war within the UK?
Gosh, well, I'm not sure it reached that stage. Well, maybe
in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I mean,
well, civil conflict. When does civil conflict become civil war? I mean, the Troubles were it's the colloquial term we use for the violence from the 70s through to the 90s in the north of Ireland that was resolved by the 98 agreement, which is a very sophisticated agreement, still worth holding on to in most of its elements, and which still would be held on to in a united Ireland, because there's a very interesting, important commitment there to the values of minority protection and human rights that would last into united Ireland, last through the transfer of sovereignty. That's one of its abiding strengths.
Thank you, John.
There we are. Yes, in respect of what you've just been talking about, one of the things that has exercised me recently has been what appears to be a change in the law being brought about by the Johnson administration, rather like a Special Powers Act. I can't remember the exact name of the bill, but what it seeks to do is to enable just about everything, including murder, to be committed by people who are acting in the interests of the state against people who are deemed to be in opposition to it. Now, my reading of that, I haven't read the actual statutes, but it does suggest to me that it would be perfectly legal for me to be dealt with if I were an active member of the SNP, which I am. And that does rather worry me. I don't know if anybody else has come across that one, but that is frightening. Yeah.
I'm not up to date with that. What I mentioned, the Brandon Lewis element, is an example of perhaps such a trend. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what made me raise the question. Yeah. Well, the observation anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it links in quite well with the talk that we had with Craig Murray when he was talking about the involvement of the Secret Service and such like moving within the independence movement already.
Yeah.
Well, you may be sure they're there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Remember, I mean, when I say existential, well, it's Scottish independence. What happens to the nuclear weaponry? What happens to the Security Council seat? I mean, it really is. It's a huge issue for the British state, much more so, it seems to me, than the Northern Ireland issue is. If you're going to make that kind of comparison, there's far more of perceived interests at stake for that ruling, caste and that regime, if you like, governing regime than there is in the Northern Ireland setting. And that's why, you know, that's why people from Scotland, there is something unique about Northern Ireland that has a genuine sense, and that's recognized, and the phrase is used, the word is used in the, you know, in the relevant treaties, and it's used consensually. And I think Scotland is distinct from that. It's not unique in the same kind of way, and I don't think the governing class in Westminster would allow the word unique to be used about Scotland in the way they use it about Northern Ireland. Is that?
Yes, and it's got I mean, Scotland is also not part of what Shaw called John Bull's other island. You know, it's mainland, it's the island, as Churchill would have said, you know. And I think that's important too, actually.
Sure.
Yeah.
Lynn Jones?
This might almost seem a sort of distraction from the more important matters, but I wonder about the symbolism of the monarchy, which I think was quite important in 100 years ago. And monarchy is a symbolic loyalty to the monarchy has still been a strong feature of loyalists in Northern Ireland. With the not too distant future, a change in the monarchy coming up and its shaky status in the public esteem. Does this have any relevance at all, do you think? Or is it merely as, you know, a sideshow? I just wonder.
Gosh, I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does have a relevance. The weakening, if it happens, on the monarchy's legitimacy for the governing regime in the UK is really central. If you think about sovereignty, I was talking about sovereignty, where does it reside? It resides in principle there. But I was participating in a very interesting discussion the other day in the University of Maynooth with Gavin Esler, who's written this book on the UK's future. And one of the participants was Bridget Laffan, who's an Irish political scientist working now in the European University Institute in Florence. But she made the point very interestingly about the functioning powers of the British monarchy when it comes to dealing with the British government, comparing it to the Italian president, who she's been observing closely, and saying that, in fact, the Italian presidency functionally has much more of a role to play in orchestrating government formation in Italy than perhaps the Queen Elizabeth has in the similar setting in the UK. Actually, that the government executive power in the UK is much stronger than it is in Italy. In which case, you know, comparing function by function, the Italian presidency is much stronger role than the British monarchy has in that kind of executive power element. Whereas the symbolic role is huge, and I'm sure it's strong in Scotland. And is this not why, I mean, Salmond a number of years ago was talking about the 4 or 5 unions as distinct from the political independence, including the monarchy? I don't know. I mean, in the north of Ireland, the monarchy is strong. How much across the communities, I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's been much work done on that. There's a kind of sentimental attachment, as there is in the Republic, to Queen Elizabeth, and her visit to Ireland was a hugely symbolic event. I mean, this was the height of the symbolic power available to that monarchy. And the return visit by Michael D. Higgins a couple of years later was equally important. And that's remembered. But in the passing and in the transition in the monarchy, it opens up questions of a difficult transition in the middle of a constitutional moment for the UK of transition can add up. I don't know, you've more insight on this than I would, but it certainly, it adds to the ingredients of destabilization, it seems to me. Black swan is an issue we deal with in scenario building. An obvious one would be a sudden transition in the monarchy.
Ian Cass.
Thank you very much. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, my apologies. Yeah, great discussion. Thanks very much for leading it, Paul. Superb. What I would like to I'm concerned that we're all getting too concerned about what might happen on the dark side of what we're trying to achieve. And what I would like to point out is things like we should be thinking about how mobilizing our young people, and we're going to do that. We should be thinking about how we mobilize that to music, art, drama, sport. I keep thinking of, you know, your Celtic connections, 784. These things have much more impact. And we should be trying to look at all the positives. In many cases, you know, Celtic connections brought together musicians from Scotland, Ireland, Canada, USA, New Zealand, wherever. And boy, did they have an impact. And that's always, when we work with people like the Irish and the Americans and the Canadians, we start to go places. And up here in Orkney, we work hard on the Scandinavian connection. By heavens, that's strong. And I want to take all that music, art, drama, sport into all these conversations. But in doing that, try to convince Denmark to speak up on our behalf and Sweden to speak up on our behalf. And we should be always trying to enlist the happy side and trying to enlist our Irish cousins, because they'd be a huge help to us.
I think that's great. I mean, you're right, and I think you've an open book on that with Ireland. You've all the channels, and far more channels than existed before, perhaps culturally, to do that. Well, I was hoping that when the Deirdre of the Sorrows story is an example of a resurrection there. Those plays haven't been done, you know, the Yeats Sing plays. They'd be worth thinking about doing in terms of high drama, but there are lots of other connections too. And I think also your point about Sweden and Denmark really interesting, because I know they have a big debate in Scotland about Nordic links as, you know, as complementing Irish and other links. And we have, of course, the old Viking connections in common as well, if you want to go back historically. But these exactly are the kinds of places you need to go to for support. When it comes to the diplomacy I mentioned, that's going to be required to legitimize any votes in favor of independence.
Yes, I perhaps should have said, Paul, I'm speaking to you from Orkney, which is a strong Norse connection, Scandinavian connection, and we're very proud of that. And we actually have an Orkney Norway Society Association, and we're the only place outside of Norway that celebrate Norway's Independence Day.
Yes.
All of these things need to be harnessed.
Yes.
And we've got all the talent we ever need. There's tons of them on this call. That if we all got together and did something positive along these lines, we'd have a huge impact.
It happens in my house. I'm married to a Norwegian, and we celebrate 2nd of May.
Excellent. Well done. Well done. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Norman.
Well, Dublin founded by the Vikings, of course. I wanted to just say this thing, talk about violence, and that would be a terrible mistake. Why don't we look towards Gandhi and all the non-violent civil disobedience type movements that there have been, you know? Think about Leipzig during the fall of the wall, so on. How can we learn from global lessons of which there must be many. I know that the Scots aren't very demonstrative. They're never going to come out and like we saw 1 million people in the streets of Barcelona. Do you have any ideas that you can point us to where non-violent civil disobedience could be thought about?
Well, I think what I would call your civic nationalism, the preparedness, the thoroughness with which the work was done ahead of the 2014 referendum, for example, all of the gradual but strong and very determined build-up of the sentiment behind Scotland's autonomy and independence is really impressive seen from afar. The nature of that nationalism, the outgoing nature of that nationalism is another real, huge strength. It's not just demonstrated by street numbers, it's demonstrated by the old, I was going to say Republican traditions that are involved in civic nationalism in Scotland, civic republicanism, if you like. That kind of tradition is there. Therefore, it's the mobilization of that is impressive impressive internationally. I think I talked about the moment 100 years ago for Ireland. It was at the high imperial moment. It's not the same kind of moment now, and therefore the non-violent methods are much more convincing. And there is also, for all the quarrels with and arguments with London, there is the principle of consent is conceded by them, which is not elsewhere, and it's a matter of getting that put legally and legitimated again, that comes into play with you. So I think I don't think there's any automatic read off at all from the Irish history of 100 years ago to your story now. It's a very different context and setting. That's what I would say.
I was struck by your quote from Lenin about decades that happen in a week. And there's a line of suddenly everything was changed utterly. Now, we don't really know what happened at Jericho. We know that there was a sudden turn, 180-degree turn in circumstances.
Yes.
I think we're near a tipping point like that suddenly things will change.
Yeah. I've done a fair amount of work in this analysis of crises in political science and history. And there's a good lot of theorizing and some very good work on it. But it always does involve this notion of tipping points, of sudden shifts, which accumulate and suddenly change, and then set a new kind of paradigm, if you like. And that's something that is a kind of elementary lesson to be drawn from historical understanding. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, right. Well, has anybody else got any questions? Nope. Right, well, I think we might as well, what time is it? It's 8:45. So I think we might as well wrap up. I've thoroughly enjoyed tonight. I don't know about everybody else. There seem to be, yeah, you've got quite a few thumbs up and nods and claps. So thank you.
Yeah, I've one sort of parting set of thoughts. We have to, I mean, in Ireland, thinking about these changes, and I mentioned the work I've been doing on unionism. Unionism in the north of Ireland is in a bind at the moment. It doesn't know it's up a side alley, really. It needs to be able to be helped to get out of that, to talk about futures, including, as I mentioned, confederal futures beyond the union even, but futures through this transition, where they're going to have to win arguments or lose them. And unless they engage, and we're having this discussion about Irish referendums, a lot of them refuse to engage with the discussion and research we're doing, because they say that only helps the the kind of unity argument along. But if you think about what's going to happen in these referendums we've been discussing, either unionism wins the argument or independence or unity win the argument, and they're going to be engaged. So we might as well try and do this in a civil way and try and convince people who are going to shift that can happen. And anything you can do from Scotland to engage with Northern Unionism, with whom you've lots and lots of cultural connections, and encourage them to take civic nationalism more seriously and understand that we have a kind of common future, whatever the outcome, the better, you know. So I think that's the kind of the good manners, if you like, of our of the search for alternative futures and constitutional futures. If it's done civilly, we come out the other end in a much better place, I think, if we can manage that.
I think it's interesting, Paul, when you talk about the Irish unity people. Am I right in thinking it's actually the opposite to what we think of as unionists in Scotland? Unionists in Scotland want to stay with Westminster, but unity people in Northern Ireland want to join with Ireland. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So unity would be the. Yeah.
It's the word that means something different. It means the opposite to what it means here. And sometimes I've been thinking, you know, what's he saying there?
I know, yes. Well, that's something we need to learn from our discussions.
Yeah. Well, that's. I've got a plan up my sleeve for not for the next guest speaker meeting, but for the one after. I'm going to keep it a little bit quiet at the moment, but it will maybe be of interest to you, because it would involve the Northern Irish unity people. So that would be interesting. And if we could make connections with them and start working with them, that would be a really good.
Well, I mean both the unity people and the union people in Northern Ireland, you know, they're both shifting in their different ways, you know, as on this debate. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Anybody else want to chip in before we leave? Yes, please. Sorry, I didn't see your hand there.
No, I've only just put it up because I'm going to give a special thank you, and I know you're going to give a very big Highland thank you to Paul for joining us this evening. But I also want to extend a special thank you from all of us here along Loch Etive, and to Deirdre and to Paul, who were excellent when they came along. And Sam MacDonald, I know, is here, and Gwen is here, Marlon Turbot is here, all of those people who were involved with the Deirdre Shieling project. And of course, Sam MacDonald, who of course was the main man with all of that. So I'm hopefully on their part when I'm saying, Paul, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time, incredibly generous with your knowledge, with your insights, and with your sharing. This has been a marvelous evening. So thank you from all here in Argyll for sure.
Here, here.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, I think we'll close the meeting now then. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you. Tapale.
Thank you.
Thank you, Val.
Thank you, Val.
Thank you.